My father threw me out the day he found out I was pregnant. I was 18. He looked me straight in the eye and told me I had exactly 2 hours to pack my things and leave. He said I had made my choice, and now I could deal with the consequences alone. Then he called me a disgrace. He had already arranged for a locksmith before he even told me I was being kicked out. By the time I carried 2 garbage bags of clothes onto the porch, the man was already changing the locks. I remember sitting on those front steps with nowhere to go, watching the house I grew up in disappear behind a brand new key. The father of my baby wasn't my boyfriend. He was a guy I met during freshman orientation at college. We spent one night together. He introduced himself as Henry, said he was visiting from Norway, and by morning he was gone. I didn't know his last name, didn't have his phone number, and had no way to find him. So when my father demanded to know who the father was, the only answer I had was the truth. I didn't know. That was enough for him to erase me. I dropped out of school before my first semester was even over. A social worker helped me get into a women's shelter, and I spent the rest of my pregnancy there. On every form they filled out, one box followed me everywhere: abandoned youth. The volunteer asked if I really had no parents willing to help. I looked at her for a long moment before saying quietly, no. She checked the box. Months later, during a freezing February storm, I took a bus alone to the county hospital. I gave birth without family, without friends, without anyone waiting outside the delivery room. A nurse named Patricia held my hand while my daughter came into the world. On the paperwork, I was listed as indigent. No emergency contact. No father present. As I held my little girl against my chest, I made her one promise. No matter what happened to me, I would never let her feel like someone else's problem. My daughter, Liana, was 4 months old when I finally managed to rent a tiny studio apartment. It should have been condemned. Black mold crept across the bathroom walls, no matter how much bleach I used. Cockroaches came out of the drains every night. In winter, the heater barely worked, and I slept in my coat more nights than I could count. Liana slept in an old dresser drawer lined with folded blankets because I couldn't afford a crib. I worked every shift nobody else wanted at a diner near the interstate. Late nights, early mornings. The customers who tipped the best were usually the ones who treated waitresses the worst. Men grabbed my wrist while I set down their coffee, called me sweetheart, left $2 on a $40 bill like I should be grateful for the attention. I smiled anyway, because smiles paid rent. Some weeks I counted coins on the kitchen counter just to decide whether we could afford laundry or whether we'd wear the same clothes another few days. I walked 3 miles to work before sunrise because the buses didn't run that early. On the way, I pushed Liana to a retired neighbor named Gloria, who watched her for almost nothing because, in her words, every baby deserves somebody in her corner. There were nights I ate plain rice so my daughter could have eggs. One winter, I skipped refilling my asthma inhaler for nearly 2 months because formula came first. Every decision was survival. Every dollar already had somewhere to go before I earned it. The hardest part wasn't being poor. It was knowing my father lived 20 minutes away. Same 5-bedroom house, same perfectly cut lawn, same country club. He never called, never asked if we were alive. As far as the rest of the family knew, I had run away to Las Vegas to become a stripper. That was the story he told everyone, and they believed him. Because believing him was easier than asking what kind of father throws his pregnant daughter onto the street. The only person who never abandoned me was my younger brother, Ethan. He was still living with our father, still depending on him for college tuition, so he couldn't openly help me. Instead, he'd text me from friends' phones, meet me in quiet parks across town, bring little bags of secondhand clothes he'd bought with his own money. Sometimes he'd slip $40 into my pocket before leaving. The first time he held his niece, he cried. He was just 17, holding his sister's baby on a park bench because it was the only place our family could safely exist. Once he admitted he'd heard Dad telling someone I had ruined my own life and deserved whatever happened next. I wanted to tell them the truth, he whispered. I wanted to scream at him. But you didn't, I said. He shook his head. I was scared. I squeezed his shoulder. It's okay. And I meant it. I refused to let my little brother destroy his own future trying to save mine. I clawed my way forward 1 inch at a time. First my GED, then community college. 2 classes each semester while working double shifts. I studied accounting because I had spent years watching numbers control my life, and I wanted to understand them before they buried me completely. Eventually, I found a better restaurant. The manager didn't allow customers to touch the servers. The tips were better, the hours steadier. After years of saving cash inside a coffee can taped beneath my kitchen sink, Liana and I finally moved into a small one-bedroom apartment. She had a real bed. I had a fold-out couch. For the first time, we had a kitchen big enough to cook dinner without balancing pans on top of the microwave. Liana grew into the brightest little girl I'd ever met. She started reading before kindergarten, solved simple math problems in grocery stores before I finished adding prices in my head. She laughed with her whole body, asked questions that left adults speechless. Everything I'd survived for her. Then, almost 5 years after the day my father threw me away, everything changed. A man walked into my restaurant. He wore an expensive coat, spoke with an accent I couldn't quite place, and kept looking at me like he was trying to remember a dream. When I came to take his order, his hands were shaking. Finally, he asked quietly, "Did you attend State University 5 years ago, during freshman orientation?" My heart stopped. I stared at him. Then I saw it. The smile, the eyes, the voice. "Henry?" He nodded slowly. "My real name is Henrik Solberg." He explained that he came from one of Norway's wealthiest families. His parents owned an international shipping and renewable energy company. When he'd studied in America for one semester, he'd introduced himself simply as Henry because he wanted one chance to live like an ordinary student instead of an heir. He looked at me with tears already forming. "I've been looking for you for 2 years." I thought I'd misheard him. He told me he'd never forgotten me. He'd searched social media, hired investigators, tracked old university records, followed every lead they could find. He'd spent years trying to locate the girl whose last name he never even learned. And somehow, that search had finally led him to my restaurant. I asked him to wait. Then I walked into the storage room, closed the door behind me, and stood there shaking. When I came back out, I sat across from him during my break. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I told him the truth. "You have a daughter." He closed his eyes. I watched every bit of color disappear from his face. "How old?" "Almost 5. His hands covered his mouth. He didn't say another word for several seconds. Finally, he whispered, "Can I see her?" I unlocked my old cracked phone and showed him my wallpaper. Liana stood in a park with chocolate ice cream smeared across her chin, smiling so hard her eyes were nearly closed. Henrik touched the screen with one finger like he was afraid she'd disappear if he pressed too hard. When he finally looked back at me, there were tears running down his face. "I've missed 5 years." "You didn't know," I answered quietly. "No." He shook his head. "I would have come, I know." For some reason, I actually believed him. He told me his family had spent the last 2 years trying to convince him to settle down and marry into another wealthy European family. He'd refused every time. He couldn't explain why. He just couldn't stop thinking about the American girl he'd met during orientation. Now he finally understood why. He asked what I wanted. Not what he wanted, not what his family wanted, what I wanted. That mattered. Within days, everything started moving, but only on my terms. First came the DNA process. Henrik insisted everything be official, court-admissible testing, lawyers, paperwork. He said our daughter deserved certainty, not promises. He opened a trust fund for Liana that nobody, not him, not me, not even his own family, could touch until she became an adult. He paid 5 years of back child support into an escrow account that would only be released after paternity was legally confirmed. Everything documented, everything transparent. Then he bought a house. Not for himself, for me. The deed went directly into my name with legal protections, making sure it could never be taken away, even if one day Henrik and I completely stopped speaking. For the first time since I was 18, I slept in a home nobody could throw me out of. 2 weeks later, his mother and sister flew in from Norway. I expected judgment, questions, suspicion. Instead, they treated me with more kindness than my own family ever had. Nobody tried to hug Liana without permission. Nobody pressured me. Nobody acted like they were entitled to anything. They simply wanted to know the little girl they'd only just discovered existed. And that's exactly when my father suddenly remembered he had a daughter. He showed up at my front door carrying grocery store flowers. He looked older, softer, almost fragile. The expression on his face would have fooled anyone who didn't know him. "I've been thinking about you every day," he said. "I was wrong. I miss you. Family should forgive. I don't want us to waste any more time." Part of me wanted to believe him, not because he deserved it, because somewhere inside me there was still an 18-year-old girl who'd spent 5 years waiting for her father to apologize. So I invited him inside. He sat on my new couch and talked for almost an hour about grief, about mistakes, about how losing my mother had broken him, about how he only wanted what was best for me. Then his eyes landed on a framed photograph sitting above the fireplace. Liana, standing between Henrik's mother and sister inside a luxury hotel. The expensive surroundings were impossible to miss. I watched something change inside my father. The sadness disappeared, greed replaced it. He picked up the frame. "Who's the little girl's father?" I told him. For a second he froze. Then he smiled. Not the smile of a father, the smile of a businessman who just discovered an opportunity. "We should celebrate Liana's birthday together. I've always wanted to visit Norway. I'm sure Henrik and I will get along wonderfully." Every sentence made it more obvious. He hadn't come back for me. He'd come back for access. Access to money, to influence, to status, to a family whose last name appeared in financial magazines. Then, Henrik walked into the room carrying a glass of water for Liana. He'd been in the kitchen the entire time. He'd heard everything. My father immediately walked toward him with his hand extended. "So good to finally meet you, son." Henrik looked at the hand, then looked directly into my father's eyes. He didn't shake it. Instead, he asked quietly, "You're the man who threw your pregnant daughter out of her home?" My father's smile disappeared. He immediately started explaining. Tough love. She had to learn responsibility. I believed she'd come back. I only wanted what was best. Henrik listened without interrupting. When my father finally stopped talking, Henrik pulled out his phone. He opened one document after another. "This is the shelter intake form." He turned the screen around. The box marked abandoned youth. Swipe. "This is the hospital record. It says she delivered alone." Swipe. "This is her emergency housing application." 8 months pregnant. Swipe. "This is the restaurant where she worked, the apartment with black mold, the WIC records, the social services file." Each document landed like another hammer blow. My father's face slowly turned white. Finally, he whispered, I didn't know it was that bad." Henrik looked at him without the slightest emotion. "You live 20 minutes away." Silence. "You changed the locks before you even told her she had to leave." Another silence. "You planned her exile." My father opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He turned toward me instead. Tears filled his eyes. "I made a terrible mistake. I thought about you every day. I've regretted it ever since." For one dangerous second, I almost believed him. Then I looked at those cheap flowers lying on my kitchen counter, and I remembered something. He hadn't come looking for me after 5 years. He'd come looking for Henrik. I took one step backward. "You need to leave." He stared at me in disbelief. I said, "You need to leave." Henrik didn't move in front of me. He simply stepped beside me. That tiny difference meant everything. For the first time in my life, someone stood with me instead of speaking for me. My father slowly picked up his flowers. At the front door, he stopped. Without turning around, he said quietly, "I'm her grandfather. There are laws." Then he walked away. I closed the door. My legs gave out. I slid down against it until I was sitting on the floor. Henrik crouched beside me. He didn't touch me, didn't rush to comfort me. He simply stayed there until I could breathe again. Then he asked one question. What did he mean by laws? I already knew. My father never made empty threats. He made plans. And somehow, I knew this wasn't over. For the next 2 days, neither of us waited for the other shoe to drop. We prepared. Henrik hired an attorney, not to represent himself, to represent me. Her name was Margot Vance. Before our first meeting, she looked directly at Henrik and made one thing perfectly clear. My client is her. If your interests ever conflict with hers, I protect her. Henrik nodded immediately. I wouldn't want it any other way. For the first time in my life, I had a lawyer whose only job was protecting me. Margot explained exactly what my father could try. Grandparent visitation. In our state, grandparents could petition the court under certain circumstances. Usually they had to prove they already had a meaningful relationship with the child, or convince a judge that losing contact would somehow harm the child. On paper, my father had almost nothing. He'd never met Liana. He didn't know her birthday, didn't know her favorite color, didn't even know her middle name. But, Margot said calmly, people like your father don't always expect to win. They expect to wear you down. She started building our defense before he'd even filed anything. Every agreement with Henrik went into writing. The trust, the house, child support, the DNA process. Nothing relied on promises. Everything relied on documents. Watching someone build legal walls around my daughter felt strangely emotional. For 5 years, I'd survived by hoping. Now, hope wasn't our only protection anymore. A few hours after that meeting, my phone buzzed. It was my brother. Dad is calling everyone. He's telling the family you're keeping his granddaughter away because you got rich. I stared at the message for a long time. 5 years earlier, every single one of those relatives had believed I was dancing in Las Vegas. Not one of them had ever called to see if I was alive. I typed one sentence, "Don't argue with him. Stay out of it." A minute later, another message appeared. "He's different this time. Please be careful." That scared me more than anything else, because Ethan knew our father better than anyone. If he was afraid, there was probably a reason. That evening, I finally told Liana that someone from Norway wanted to meet her. I didn't call him her father. Not yet. Nothing had been confirmed. I simply explained that he was an old friend who'd recently found us. She listened carefully, then asked the most 5-year-old question imaginable. "Is he nice?" "I think so." She thought about it. "Does he like cartoons?" I laughed. "I honestly don't know. I guess I'll ask him." That was enough for her. Children have an incredible way of making enormous things feel wonderfully simple. Our first meeting happened in a public park. Henrik arrived early. No expensive presents, no grand gestures, just an old soccer ball tucked under one arm. He crouched to Liana's height before saying hello. He didn't hug her, didn't reach for her. He waited. She hid behind my leg at first, peeked around me, finally whispered, "My favorite color is green." Henrik smiled. "Mine too." They kicked the soccer ball back and forth across the grass, slowly, patiently. After a while, she frowned at him. "You talk funny." "I know," he laughed. "I'm from Norway." "Do they have McDonald's there?" "Yes, but the menu looks completely different." "Really?" "The words are in Norwegian." She stared at him with wide eyes. "So, you have Norwegian chicken nuggets?" He burst out laughing. "So we do." By the end of the afternoon, she was showing him how high she could swing without being scared. Every few minutes, she'd look back to make sure I was still sitting on the bench. Every time, I was. On the drive home, she stayed quiet. Finally, she announced, "The Norway friend is bad at saying chicken nuggets." I smiled. "You're probably right." That was her official review. A few days later, my father left me a voicemail. He said he'd forgiven me for keeping his granddaughter away from him, for refusing to let him heal, for holding on to the past. I listened once, deleted it, and realized something. Silence felt better than defending myself. I'd spent years explaining my life to people who had already decided who I was. I wasn't doing it anymore. Instead, I went to the public library after work and spent an hour reading every law I could find about grandparent visitation. Margot had been right. The law was narrow. My father had almost no legal foundation. But anyone with enough money could still force a family through months of expensive litigation. Sometimes, the lawsuit itself was the punishment. I photographed every page and emailed them to Margot. She replied less than an hour later. "We're ready if he files." A week later, Ethan asked if we could meet. We chose a small coffee shop across town. He looked exhausted. "I want to tell everyone the truth." "You don't have to." "I should. You shouldn't lose your future because of me." He rubbed his face. "I'm tired of being scared." So was I. We sat quietly for a minute. Then I reached across the table and took his hand. "You already saved me." He looked confused. "Those $40? The baby clothes? The secret texts?" "You were the only person who came." His eyes filled with tears. "So finish school. Get your freedom. And then build your own life." We both cried a little. Not because things were hopeless, because for the first time, maybe they weren't. The next morning, my phone rang while I was working. It was Liana's preschool. The director sounded calm, almost too calm. "Mrs. Carter." "A man came in today asking questions." Every muscle in my body tightened. "What man?" "He identified himself as your daughter's grandfather." My blood ran cold. He wanted to know who was authorized to pick her up, what time classes ended, whether grandparents were allowed to collect children. I was already grabbing my keys before she finished speaking. "I'll be there in 5 minutes." When I arrived, the director met me at the entrance. We didn't tell him anything. He doesn't know she's enrolled here. He left empty-handed. Then she slid a form across the counter. "If you'd like, we can place a permanent restriction in her file. Only approved adults. Everyone else gets turned away immediately." I signed it before she finished explaining. As I stood there writing names with shaking hands, I looked through the playground window. Liana was laughing with another little girl, completely unaware that her grandfather had just tested the locks around her life. exactly the way he'd once tested the locks on mine. That's when I truly understood something. He never broke doors down. He looked for windows, and I knew he wasn't finished yet. The same afternoon through Margot, I sent my father a formal letter. It was simple, professional, and impossible to misunderstand. He was not to contact me directly. He was not to approach my daughter. He was not to visit her school, daycare, babysitters, or our home. If he wanted to communicate, it would happen through attorneys. Nothing else. Signing that letter made me physically sick. Not because I thought it was wrong, because I'd spent my entire life believing my father's feelings were somehow my responsibility, that keeping the peace mattered more than keeping myself safe. But now I wasn't protecting only myself. I was protecting my daughter, and that changed everything. That night I bought a notebook. Margot had suggested keeping a written record of everything. Every phone call, every message, every unexpected visit, every threat. At first it felt unnecessary. Then I realized something. My father had spent years rewriting history. Paper couldn't. The notebook never argued, never forgot. It simply remembered. A week later, Henrik came over carrying a glossy toy catalog. He opened it on my kitchen table. I found something beautiful. It was a handcrafted dollhouse from Europe, real wood, working lights, tiny furniture. Price, $3,000. I stared at it. $3,000. That was more than 2 months' stipend. Rent in the apartment where Liana had slept inside a dresser drawer. Henrik looked hopeful. I thought she deserved something special. I closed the catalog gently. She does. But not this. He frowned. I don't understand. I smiled. Because you've never had to. I explained that children don't remember expensive toys nearly as well as they remember ordinary days with people they love. Trips to the zoo, the science museum, feeding ducks, building pillow forts, making pancakes on Saturday mornings. Those memories stay. Most toys don't. He listened without interrupting, then quietly pushed the catalog away. So, science museum this weekend? I laughed. Perfect. That moment told me more about Henrik than any expensive gift ever could. He was willing to change his mind. The DNA appointment happened the following Monday. Everything was official. Witnesses, identification, chain of custody. The technician swabbed the inside of Liana's cheek. She giggled. Does this mean I have cavities? Henrik smiled. Not exactly. She accepted that answer and skipped back toward the waiting room. Neither of us wanted to explain what was really happening until we had actual results. Afterward, she spent the entire drive home talking about how funny the cotton swab had felt. Children somehow managed to keep life wonderfully normal. That afternoon, while I was rolling silverware before dinner service, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. A reporter. She politely explained she'd heard rumors about a wealthy Norwegian heir discovering he had a daughter in America. She wanted my side before publishing anything. My stomach dropped. I locked myself inside the employee restroom and called Margot immediately. She answered on the second ring. I just got a call from a reporter. Good. Now listen carefully. She spoke slowly. You say absolutely nothing. No comment. No clarification. No denial. No confirmation. Nothing. But no, she stopped me. Stories like this survive on attention. If nobody feeds them, they usually die. She was right. I ignored every message. Within a few days, the rumors disappeared. Silence turned out to be stronger than any explanation. A week later, another envelope arrived. My father's handwriting covered the front. Inside was a 5-page letter. At first glance, it looked like an apology. Then I read it again. Every apology came attached to a demand. I'm sorry. So now you should let me see Liana. I'm sorry. So now we should spend holidays together. I'm sorry. So now we should all travel to Norway. I'm sorry. So now it's time to move on. By the second reading, I finally saw it clearly. He wasn't apologizing. He was negotiating. He wanted something. Again. The letter went straight into my evidence folder. A few mornings later, Ethan called before sunrise. His voice was shaking. Open Dad's Facebook. I hadn't looked at his page in years. The first thing I saw was a brand new photo album. My pride and joy. 30 old family photographs. Christmas mornings, camping trips, birthday cakes, Mom smiling beside us before she died. Every caption praised family, love, memories, being a devoted father. The comments poured in. You were always such an amazing dad. Beautiful family. God bless you all. I kept scrolling. Then I realized something. Every single picture was older than my pregnancy. Not one photo from the 5 years after he'd thrown me away, because during those 5 years, according to him, I didn't exist. Ethan had already saved screenshots of every picture, every caption, every comment. I thought you might need these someday. I think I already do. I saved everything into the evidence folder. For years, my father controlled the story because he was the only one telling it. Now, someone else was keeping records too. Henrik visited later that week carrying nothing more expensive than a calendar. A giant monthly calendar. Stickers, stars, little airplanes, purple hearts. He spread everything across the kitchen table. We're making a schedule. Liana's eyes lit up. She carefully chose gold stars for the days Henrik would visit, purple hearts for video call days, then taped the finished calendar beside her bed. Every morning, she'd count how many sleeps remained until the next visit. Watching her do that, I realized Henrik wasn't trying to buy 5 years back. He was earning tomorrow, one ordinary day at a time. 3 days later, the DNA results arrived. Neither of us opened the envelope immediately. We simply sat together on my couch for several seconds. Finally, I broke the seal. Probability of paternity? Over 99.999%. Exactly what we'd both expected. That evening, we sat down with Liana. Henrik spoke first. I've wanted to tell you something. She looked back and forth between us. He smiled gently. I'm your daddy. I didn't know you were here. But the moment I found out, I came. She stared at him quietly. Neither of us rushed her. Finally, she asked, so, does that mean I have grandparents in Norway too? Henrik laughed through tears. Yes, you do. She thought for another few seconds, then nodded. Okay. And walked upstairs carrying her crayons. Children have their own way of processing enormous news. She needed time. We gave it to her. Later that evening, Henrik cried. Not loudly, not dramatically. He simply covered his face with his hands. I missed everything. The first steps, first words, the first day of school. I put my hand on his shoulder. It wasn't your choice? I know, but I still missed it. Neither of us spoke after that. Sometimes there aren't words big enough. Dr. Reyes, the child therapist Margot recommended, met with us the following week. Before she ever spoke to Liana, she spent nearly an hour asking Henrik and me questions. How had Liana handled change in the past? Did she struggle with separation? How attached was she to routines? What frightened me the most? Then she invited Liana into the room alone. No pressure, no interrogation, just toys, crayons, stuffed animals, and quiet conversation. At the end of the session, Dr. Follot, Reyes smiled. She's doing remarkably well, but she's watching both of you much more closely than either of you realizes. She explained that children don't judge stability by words. They judge it by repetition. Who comes back? Who keeps promises? Who shows up when they said they would? That became Henrik's job. Not buying presents, not making up for lost years. Simply showing up. Every scheduled visit, every Wednesday video call, every promise kept, one ordinary day after another. A week later, Liana drew a picture during another therapy session. She drew herself in the middle, me on one side, Henrik on the other. Above her own head, she drew a huge thought bubble, filled entirely with question marks. Dr. Reyes asked softly, "What are you wondering about?" Liana looked down at her drawing. "I'm scared Daddy will disappear again." The room became completely silent. Then she quickly added, "I know it wasn't his fault before. But what if he goes away anyway?" That single sentence explained everything. She wasn't afraid because Henrik had left. She was afraid because the world had already taught her people disappear. Dr. Reyes looked at Henrik. "The only answer you can give her is time. Keep showing up. Eventually her heart will believe what her eyes are already seeing." He nodded. "I will." And he did. Not once did he miss a visit. Not once did he cancel a call. Slowly, the question marks started disappearing. Around the same time, another problem found us. One evening while I was working, a regular customer smirked as I brought his dinner. "So, I heard you landed yourself some rich foreign billionaire." A few nearby tables laughed. He leaned closer. "Pretty convenient getting pregnant, huh?" I froze, then calmly placed his plate in front of him. "That's inappropriate." He laughed louder. "I'm just saying." Before I could answer, my manager appeared. He looked directly at the customer. "Pay your bill." The man blinked. "What? You heard me. You're done here. It was a joke. My staff didn't laugh." The customer argued for another minute before finally throwing cash onto the table and storming out. My manager walked into the kitchen afterward and quietly squeezed my shoulder. "Take 5. No speech, no drama, just support." I stood in the storage room shaking, then realized why. For years, nobody had ever stepped between me and people trying to hurt me. Now, people did, and my body still didn't know how to accept it. A few days later, Margot called. "We're scheduling mediation. My father had agreed. There were conditions. He had to acknowledge what he'd done. Specifically, without excuses, without blaming grief, without talking about tough love, just facts. When mediation began, my father cried almost immediately. He admitted he'd made mistakes. Then, exactly as Margot predicted, he started explaining them. I was grieving. I thought it would help her. I believed she'd come home. The mediator stopped him. Gentle reminder. No explanations. Only acknowledgement. He tried again. Failed again. Every apology somehow found its way back to a justification. Eventually, the mediator ended the session. She handed him homework. Write everything down. Every action. No excuses. Come back in 2 weeks. Outside the building, I felt strangely calm. For the first time in my life, I'd looked my father in the eye and spoken the truth. Nothing terrible had happened. Meanwhile, Henrik and I finalized a temporary parenting agreement. Every other Saturday together. Wednesday evening video calls. Financial support documented. Shared decisions about school and healthcare. Everything written, everything signed, everything witnessed. Afterward, we walked to a nearby cafe. Henrik stirred his coffee for a long time before speaking. My father wants me to marry you. I looked up. He thinks it would solve everything. I laughed once. Not because it was funny, because it was exhausting. Henrik quickly shook his head. I already told him no. He didn't like that answer. I imagined. He smiled. I told him we're learning to be parents. Not planning a wedding. If we ever become anything more, it has to happen because we choose it. Not because people expect it. Relief washed over me. Both my father and Henrik's father wanted to organize my life. The difference was simple. Henrik refused to let anyone make that decision for me. That mattered. More than flowers, more than money, more than promises. A month later, Margot received confirmation that my father had actually started therapy. Real appointments, weekly sessions. She slid the paperwork across her desk. People can change, she paused, but paperwork isn't change. Consistency is. I nodded. She was right. Words had fooled me before, actions hadn't. Not long after that, Ethan called. His voice sounded different, lighter. I finally told Dad no. I smiled. What happened? He wanted me to pressure you again. I told him if he had something to say, he could say it through his lawyer. Silence. And? He hung up. We both laughed. It wasn't a huge victory, but for Ethan, it was enormous. For the first time in his life, he'd chosen himself over our father's approval. 2 weeks later, mediation resumed. This time, my father brought 3 handwritten pages. He read every word aloud. He admitted giving me 2 hours to leave, calling the locksmith before telling me, ignoring Ethan's pleas, lying to the family, leaving me to give birth alone. For the first time, he finished every sentence without adding but. When he was done, he looked at me. I'm sorry. Not perfect, not enough, but real enough that I believed he meant those specific words. I took a long breath. I accept this as a beginning. Not forgiveness. Not yet. You don't earn back 5 years in one afternoon. He nodded. I know. Afterward, Dr. Rise helped me create one final list. If my father ever wanted a relationship with Liana, he would have to earn it. 6 months of verified therapy, respect every boundary, no contacting her school, no contacting Ethan, and no surprise visits, no manipulation. Only after all of that would we even discuss one supervised meeting. Nothing more. He accepted every condition. For the first time, it almost looked like he understood what rebuilding trust actually meant. Almost. 6 months. That was the agreement. 6 months before we would even discuss whether my father had earned the right to meet Liana under supervision. Margot called it a roadmap. Dr. Reyes called it accountability. I simply called it peace, because for the first time since I was 18, the next move wasn't his. It was mine. Life slowly settled into something that finally resembled normal. Henrik visited every Saturday, never late, never canceled. If work kept him in Europe longer than expected, he'd call exactly when he promised. Sometimes the conversations lasted 15 minutes, sometimes an hour. Liana didn't care. She only cared that when the calendar said Daddy would call, Daddy called. One afternoon, she proudly announced to me, I don't count the sleeps anymore. Why not? Because I know he'll come. I had to turn away so she wouldn't see me cry. That tiny sentence meant more than any DNA result. More than court papers, more than trust funds. Trust wasn't being explained to her anymore. She was living it. Around the same time, Henrik officially moved part of his business operations to the United States. Not because I asked, not because of lawyers, because he wanted to be close enough to watch his daughter grow up. He rented an apartment 20 minutes away, close enough to be present, far enough that neither of us felt rushed into becoming something we weren't ready for. People constantly assumed we were getting married. We weren't. Not because we couldn't, because neither of us wanted to build a relationship out of guilt, pressure, or gratitude. We were learning how to become partners in parenting first. Everything else could wait. One Saturday morning, Liana looked at Henrik very seriously. "If you're my daddy, does that mean I have two grandpas?" Henrik smiled. "You do." She thought for a second. "I only want one." Neither of us answered immediately. Finally, Henrik asked, "Why?" She shrugged. "Because Grandpa Tom brings cookies. Daddy's mommy hugs me. The other grandpa makes mommy sad. Children rarely complicate what adults spend years overthinking. To her, that was enough. Months passed. Every month, Margot received attendance records from my father's therapist. Every month, she reviewed them. Every month, the answer stayed the same. Not yet. Then one afternoon, Ethan called me. "Dad asked about Liana today." My stomach tightened. What did he ask? He wanted to know what cartoons she likes. I waited. He didn't ask where she goes to school. He didn't ask where you live. He didn't ask about Henrik. He only asked what cartoons she likes. For some reason, that tiny difference mattered. Maybe therapy was teaching him something, or maybe it wasn't. Time would tell. The 6-month review finally arrived. Margot, Dr. Reyes, the therapist reports. Everyone sat around one conference table. No emotion, just facts. My father had attended every session. He'd followed every legal boundary. No surprise visits, no phone calls, no messages through relatives, no attempts to manipulate Ethan, no contact with the preschool, no social media posts, nothing. Margot looked at me. "The decision is yours." Nobody pushed me. Nobody expected forgiveness. Nobody expected reconciliation. Just a decision. I looked down at my hands, then quietly asked, "What does Dr. Reyes think?" She answered carefully, "I think supervised contact could be emotionally safe if Liana wants it." That last part mattered. If, nobody would force her. That evening I sat beside Liana while she colored dinosaurs across the kitchen table. I asked gently, "Do you remember the man who came to our house with flowers?" She nodded. "The sad grandpa." "Yes." "Would you ever want to meet him?" She kept coloring for almost a full minute. Finally she shrugged. "Maybe. If you come too." "I would. And Daddy? I think he would too." She nodded once. "Okay." That was all. No dramatic speech, no fear, no excitement, just cautious curiosity. The first meeting happened in a family therapy office. Bright walls, board games, stuffed animals. My father arrived early. He looked older than I remembered, smaller somehow. When Liana walked into the room holding my hand, he didn't move. He didn't reach toward her. He didn't even stand up. He simply smiled. "Hello, Liana." She looked at him for a second, then quietly said, "Hi." Dr. Reyes suggested they play a board game together, Candyland. For 40 minutes they rolled dice, moved colorful pieces, talked about cartoons, dinosaurs, favorite ice cream, nothing deeper, nothing forced. When the session ended, my father looked at Liana. "Thank you for letting me meet you," she waved. "Bye." That was it. No hugs, no promises, no photographs, no pretending 5 lost years had magically disappeared. Outside the building, my father stopped a few feet away from me. "I know I don't deserve another chance." "No, you don't. I know." He looked down. "I also know. Whether I ever earn one isn't my decision anymore." For the first time in my life, he understood. Control had left his hands, and he wasn't fighting to take it back. A year later, Ethan graduated from college. The ceremony was held on a warm spring afternoon. My father sat on one side of the auditorium. I sat on the other. Neither of us argued over where to sit. Neither of us tried to make the day about ourselves. When Ethan walked across the stage, we both stood to applaud. After the ceremony, he hugged me first, then Liana, then Henrik. Only after that did he walk over to Dad. Watching my little brother choose the order for himself made me realize how much had changed. No one was controlling him anymore. As we walked toward the parking lot, Liana slipped one hand into mine and the other into Henrik's. She looked up at both of us and smiled. "Can we get ice cream?" Henrik laughed. "I think that's an excellent idea." I looked down at my daughter. 5 years earlier, she'd slept in a dresser drawer because I couldn't afford a crib. Now she was surrounded by people who chose her every single day. Money changed our circumstances, but it wasn't what saved us. Boundaries did. Truth did. The courage to walk away did. The day my father threw me out, I thought he'd ended my future. He hadn't. He'd only removed himself from it. And in the life I built afterward, that turned out to be the greatest gift he never intended to give.